When a young woman suddenly went silent and stopped answering her phone, her family knew right away something was wrong. The police got involved, and at first it seemed like the mystery of her disappearance would be solved quickly. But what followed felt more like the plot of a crime drama than real life. And when the full truth finally came out, it sent shockwaves across the entire country. Andrea Ilber was born on April 17, 1991, in Flint, Michigan. When she was little, her mother passed away, and after some time, her father remarried. The family eventually moved to the small town of Otisville, where Andrea finished high school. After graduation, she got a job at a supermarket not far from home. Andrea thought about going to college, but she wasn't sure what direction to take yet, so she kept working and saving up for the future. That's also where she met a coworker, a 19-year-old named Kenneth, and before long, the two started dating. In November 2011, when Andrea was 20 years old, her aunt and uncle went out of town and asked her to look after their house. At the time, Andrea was still living with her parents, so she decided to stay at her relative's place until they came back. For the first few days, her boyfriend Kenneth and one of their friends came over. They'd hang out, watch movies, and just have fun together. After that, Andrea and Kenneth made plans to spend the next day together. Andrea was supposed to pick him up on the evening of November 14th, but shortly before that, she texted him to say she couldn't make it. Instead, she told him to come over to her aunt and uncle's place and asked him to bring along some movie DVDs. Kenneth showed up around 7:30 p.m., but the house was dark, the doors were locked, and Andrea's car wasn't there. He knocked, but no one answered. He then tried calling her, but she didn't pick up. Thinking she might have stepped out for a bit, he decided to wait. About half an hour later, he finally got a text from her. Andrea said her plans had changed and promised they'd see each other the next day. She didn't explain where she had gone, and none of Kenneth's follow-up messages ever got a reply. The next day came and went, and Andrea still didn't reach out. At first, Kenneth was the only one worried. Since she was staying at her aunt and uncle's place, Andrea's dad didn't think much of it when he didn't hear from her. But by the following day, when Andrea wasn't answering his calls either, he started to get anxious. He asked another relative to check out the house, and she went there with Kenneth. They walked around, looked through the windows, but the place was empty. Her father then started calling Andrea's friends, and none of them had heard from her in more than 24 hours. That's when her family began to fear something bad had happened, so they decided it was time to start searching. Andrea's family and friends split up into groups and started driving around nearby towns, parks, and anywhere else she might have gone. By evening, one of her friends spotted her car. It was parked in a remote area near a national park, just a few miles from her relative's house. The doors were unlocked, and the keys were missing. But there was no sign of Andrea herself. Her father immediately called police, who then contacted Andrea's uncle, and with his permission, officers forced their way into the house. When they went down into the basement, they were met with a horrifying sight. Andrea was sitting in a chair, with a gunshot wound to her head. Her body was taken to the medical examiner, who determined she'd been killed by a single shot fired from several feet away. As for the timeline, Andrea had been murdered 2 days before her body was found, on the very night she had planned to spend time with Kenneth, but suddenly canceled. The examiner also discovered markings on her wrists showing that they'd been bound with plastic zip ties, though by the time police found her, those restraints were gone. Even stranger, the analysis suggested they had been removed about 6 or 7 hours after her death, implying either the killer came back later or stayed in the house for most of the night. Investigators also learned that some items were missing from the house, but the scene didn't look like a typical burglary. Almost all valuables were left untouched. Instead, the killer had taken things like a bottle of perfume, a sweater, a camera, 3 knives, a rifle, some bullets, and a bit of cash. Meanwhile, jewelry and even a small piece of solid gold that was sitting out in plain view were left behind. While crime scene techs combed through the house, detectives learned Andrea had a boyfriend and headed straight to Kenneth's place. He told them when he'd last seen her and handed over a DNA sample and fingerprints without hesitation. Police also collected the clothes he'd worn that night and searched his house. But nothing suspicious turned up. Still, they brought Kenneth back in for more questioning, and over time, detectives started leaning toward the theory that he was the killer. Kenneth denied it all and even agreed to take a polygraph, which showed no signs of deception. He explained that on the night of November 14th, after Andrea suddenly canceled their plans, he was crushed. He figured the only reason she'd backed out was because she was planning to break up with him. So, he went home, plugged in his phone, and messaged a female friend, telling her Andrea was probably about to dump him. They texted back and forth for a while, and then Kenneth drove to the store where that friend worked. The two continued talking about the situation, and eventually she told him she and her roommate were planning to watch a movie that night and invited him over. Kenneth showed up at their place around 10 p.m., something both girls later confirmed. On top of that, his phone data backed him up, showing it connected to a nearby cell tower at that time. About 20 minutes earlier, he was also caught on a surveillance camera at a gas station located between the store and the girl's house. That same night, police learned that someone had withdrawn $300 from Andrea's bank card. The transaction happened in a town called Davison, about a 30-minute drive from her uncle's house. But here's the catch. The withdrawal was made just 7 minutes after Kenneth showed up at his friend's place. There was simply no way he could have been in both places, yet detectives weren't ready to cross him off the suspect list. Kenneth stayed with his friends until around midnight, then headed home. The next morning, he tried calling Andrea several times, but she never picked up. Concerned, he drove back to her relative's house around 10 a.m. and knocked on the door, but there was still no sign of her, so he left. By about 11 a.m., he was back home, something confirmed by both his family members and his phone's location data. At almost the exact same time, another $300 was withdrawn from Andrea's account, this time in a different town even farther away. Police also got hold of surveillance footage showing the person using her card. The quality was too poor to make out a face, but one detail stood out. The suspect had arrived in a white pickup truck. But even with all the evidence pointing away from him, police still weren't ready to let Kenneth off the hook. They thought there were a few things about his story that didn't add up. First, he had admitted that he drove to Andrea's relative's house right around the time she was killed, and sat in his car outside for about half an hour, which sounded weird for detectives. Second, when Andrea's friends and family organized a search for her on the evening of November 15th, Kenneth told them he wouldn't be joining because he had to work early the next morning. Later, he explained to detectives that he'd already spent the entire day trying to find her, calling her over and over, and figured she was just ignoring him. In his mind, Andrea had probably decided to break up with him, not that something bad had happened. Another red flag came up when one of Kenneth's friends, who'd been out searching for Andrea, asked him for the address of her relative's house. For some reason, Kenneth gave him the wrong location, about 3 miles from the real one. Investigators thought this was strange since Kenneth had spent plenty of time there before. None of this was solid proof of guilt, but detectives pressed him harder and harder, piling on over 10 hours of interrogations. And eventually, police announced that Kenneth had finally confessed to the crime. In his written confession, Kenneth claimed that he went over to Andrea's that night and walked into the house. When he went down to the basement, he said he saw her body lying on the floor and assumed she did it herself. According to him, that's when he decided to stage the scene to look like a murder, so her family wouldn't find out the truth. He admitted to taking a few items that were lying nearby, but offered little else. The confession itself was short, vague, and full of ambiguous wording. Kenneth insisted he hadn't killed Andrea, only that he'd found her body. But detectives believed they finally had what they needed, and they placed him under arrest. The moment police told him he was being charged with murder, Kenneth immediately tried to retract his statement. He said detectives had pressured him for hours, hammering him with accusations until he was completely exhausted. Finally, they told him that if he just wrote down a version of events where he found Andrea's body, they would let him go home. Kenneth said he believed them, but instead, his so-called confession became the cornerstone of the case against him. He also claimed detectives repeatedly misled him, They told him they had solid forensic evidence tying him to the crime, and that he had failed the polygraph miserably. But the most shocking detail came out later. Kenneth's grandfather had actually hired a lawyer and sent him to the station to help. When the attorney tried to find out where Kenneth was being held, one of the detectives simply hung up the phone and then warned his colleagues not to reveal Kenneth's location to anyone. The lawyer spent the entire day calling every officer he could reach, but no one would give him answers. Meanwhile, Kenneth had no idea that the lawyer was even trying to reach him, and he continued talking to detectives alone. According to Kenneth, his so-called confession was nothing more than him parroting back what detectives told him to say, just so they'd finally let him go home. In reality, he claimed, he had no idea Andrea was even dead. Less than 24 hours after Andrea's body was found, detectives announced they had their killer. Kenneth's friends and family refused to believe he was involved, but at that point, there wasn't much they could do. Meanwhile, police basically shut down the investigation, convinced Kenneth's confession would be enough to secure a conviction. Forensics, however, painted a very different picture. Lab experts tested dozens of samples collected from the house, including skin found under Andrea's fingernails. The DNA turned out to belong to an unknown male, and it was definitively not a match to Kenneth. Later, another sample was recovered from Andrea's car, and it matched that same unidentified man. Then there was the whole deal with Andrea's bank card. Someone had been draining her account, but it clearly wasn't Kenneth, and police still had no clue who that mystery man could be. Despite these glaring red flags, just days after Kenneth's arrest, detectives claimed they had new evidence. One officer opened the sealed bag containing Kenneth's clothes from the night Andrea vanished, and noticed a single bloody hair stuck to his pants. Tests revealed the hair and blood both belonged to Andrea. But this supposed smoking gun had a huge problem. The pants themselves showed no trace of blood, not even microscopic particles. The forensic specialist who examined the item concluded that the hair must have landed there hours after Andrea's death, because if Kenneth had been wearing those pants during the murder, blood spatter would have been unavoidable. Kenneth's lawyer argued that the hair was most likely contamination. Police had grabbed Kenneth's clothes barely 30 minutes after Andrea's body was found. It was entirely possible that an officer, still carrying trace evidence from the crime scene, accidentally transferred the hair onto the pants while packing up his belongings. Kenneth's lawyer also pushed to have his confession thrown out, arguing that police had deliberately blocked him from seeing his client during questioning. On top of that, portions of the interrogation video had mysteriously gone missing, precisely the parts where, according to Kenneth, detectives were practically feeding him the right answers. The legal back and forth dragged on for 4 years, until the court finally sided with the prosecution and ruled the confession would stay in. During all this time, Kenneth remained out on bail, but he was far from free. He had to wear a GPS ankle monitor and wasn't allowed to leave his house without police approval. The trial began in 2015, and the prosecution leaned on just 2 pillars: Kenneth's confession and the bloody hair found on his pants. Their theory was that the murder was committed during a robbery, even though none of the stolen items ever turned up in Kenneth's possession, and the victim's bank card was clearly used by someone else. The prosecutor tried to smooth over the contradiction by suggesting the robbery was staged. In other words, he argued Kenneth killed Andrea to steal money and valuables, yet also insisted he faked the robbery. This argument was shaky at best, especially since Kenneth's family was well off and he wasn't desperate for cash. The prosecution also pointed to another detail. There were no signs of forced entry at the house, and Kenneth had a spare key. Andrea had given it to him just a few days before she died, so he could stop by whenever he wanted. But Kenneth insisted he had left the key on a table in the house 2 days before her death. His friend, who had been with him that day, backed up his story, and sure enough, police eventually found the spare key right where he said it would be. The defense, on the other hand, pointed to countless inconsistencies in the case and outright sloppy police work. They also highlighted something investigators seemed to ignore. Andrea's car had been taken and later abandoned a few miles from the house. Her father testified that the car had one particular problem. Oil constantly leaked onto the floor under the driver's seat, which meant Andrea's shoes were always stained. By that logic, anyone who drove the car would have gotten oil on their soles too. Yet when experts examined Kenneth's boots, there wasn't a trace of it. The prosecutor fired back with a new theory. Kenneth must have had an accomplice. According to this version, Kenneth killed Andrea while the accomplice took the stolen items, drove off in her car, and used her bank card. But another problem loomed over the prosecutor's case. The murder weapon was never found. Investigators determined that the missing rifle from Andrea's uncle's house didn't match the bullet that killed her, and neither did Kenneth's parents' guns. Finally, Kenneth's lawyer accused police of completely overlooking other viable suspects. From the very beginning, they had tunnel vision on Kenneth and never gave anyone else a serious look. To prove the point, the defense presented a list of 5 potential suspects, and on the top of that list was a man named Jeffrey, a mutual acquaintance of both Kenneth and Andrea. There were a few red flags around Jeffrey. First, he was the one who just happened to find Andrea's car in the early hours of the search, even though it was parked miles away from her house in a fairly secluded spot. Second, that same day he called Kenneth asking questions about Andrea's whereabouts. The odd thing was, Kenneth had never given him his number. Investigators later learned Andrea had scribbled his number on a piece of paper and left it on a nightstand, right next to where an unidentified DNA sample was later recovered. On top of all that, Jeffrey owned a car that looked very similar to the one caught on surveillance footage at a gas station when someone was withdrawing money with Andrea's bank card. Andrea's brother also pointed investigators toward another possible suspect. He admitted that he had been struggling with drugs at the time and owed money to a local dealer. According to him, this dealer somehow knew Andrea had been saving a good amount of cash from her job. That's why her brother believed the dealer might have killed Andrea to get the money he was owed. There was also a young man named David who came onto police radar after his own father called in a tip, telling them his son could be involved in Andrea's murder. David already had a criminal history tied to car thefts and assaults, and he even resembled the man seen withdrawing money from Andrea's bank card. Despite all this, detectives claimed they had looked into each of these leads, but couldn't find any hard evidence linking them to the crime. When the trial wrapped up, the jury deliberated for 2 full days before reaching a verdict. In the end, they found Kenneth guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His lawyer immediately filed an appeal. At first, the defense tried to overturn the conviction by arguing that Kenneth's confession was coerced and that police illegally denied him access to a lawyer. But the court rejected that motion. Next, the defense focused on the robbery charge, pointing out that Kenneth was also found guilty of theft, even though none of the stolen items were ever recovered. That appeal also went nowhere. But the third attempt finally paid off. Kenneth's lawyer discovered a serious mistake in the jury paperwork. On the verdict forms, jurors were given 2 separate murder charges to consider: first degree and second degree. For the first degree charge, they had both options, guilty or not guilty. But for second degree, there was only one option listed: guilty. In other words, the jury had no way to find Kenneth not guilty on the second degree charge. Their only choice was to decide how guilty he was. The appeals court couldn't ignore such a major flaw, and in 2018, Kenneth was granted a brand new trial. By that point, he had already spent 3 years behind bars, and after the ruling, he was released on bail once again. Since then, Kenneth's lawyer kept pushing for new evidence, something that could finally point to the real killer. He repeatedly urged police to retest the existing DNA samples, and in 2022, they finally agreed to launch a fresh review. By that time, Kenneth's new trial still hadn't begun, and he remained out on bail. Forensic experts went back through every unidentified male DNA sample connected to the case. But once again, there were no matches in the FBI's database. So, they focused on the strongest piece of evidence they had: a cigarette butt found outside the house. That sample matched the same man whose skin cells had been discovered under Andrea's fingernails, leaving no doubt he was the real killer. Investigators sent the cigarette butt to Othram, a company specializing in forensic genetic genealogy. In January 2023, experts reported a breakthrough. By searching public genetic databases and tracing family connections, they had identified a likely suspect. It was a 42-year-old man named Chadwick Modley, someone who had never even come up in the original case files. Detectives learned that at the time of Andrea's murder, Chadwick had been living just 40 minutes away in a neighboring town. They pulled his phone records from November 2011 and found out that on the day Andrea was killed, his phone pinged off a tower near her aunt and uncle's house 23 times. By 2023, Chadwick was living in Utah, working as a delivery driver and staying out of his van. Investigators reached out to local police, asking them to secretly collect something with his DNA on it. But there was a problem. Since Chadwick usually parked in open areas, tailing him without being noticed was nearly impossible. Officers kept watch for 2 months, but they never managed to recover a single item that could yield a DNA sample. So, detectives decided to confront him directly. Armed with a warrant, they approached Chadwick and collected his DNA sample. During the conversation, he denied any involvement in Andrea's death. But soon after, lab results confirmed that his DNA was under Andrea's fingernails, inside her car, and in multiple places around the house. And if that wasn't enough, when police searched his van, they found a revolver. Ballistic tests proved it was the very weapon used to kill Andrea. 2 days after that first talk, police went back out to arrest Chadwick, but he was already gone. Apparently, he just drove in an unknown direction right after the conversation with police. 3 weeks later, he turned up in Montana near the Canadian border, where officers finally caught him. But the drama didn't stop there. While being transported to the airport for extradition back to Michigan, Chadwick managed to escape from a police van. He somehow freed himself from both handcuffs and leg irons and disappeared once again. A few days later, a local sheriff happened to accidentally spot him paddling down a river in a canoe. That sighting led to his second capture, and this time, authorities successfully brought him to Michigan, where he was locked up awaiting trial. Bail was immediately denied. After all, he had already escaped twice. Chadwick pleaded not guilty, and prosecutors began building their case. For local law enforcement, it was a nightmare. They had spent more than a decade insisting Kenneth was the killer, tearing his life apart in the process. And now, the evidence, DNA under Andrea's nails and the actual murder weapon, pointed directly at Chadwick. Investigators even tried to see if there was any link between Kenneth and Chadwick, some chance they'd work together. But there wasn't. The two men had no ties at all, and Andrea didn't appear to know Chadwick either. At the time of her murder, he was a 32-year-old living in a neighboring town with no connection to her. Still, even with this mountain of new evidence, Kenneth's conviction wasn't thrown out. He remained at home under strict monitoring with an ankle bracelet. What's worse, prosecutors doubled down. They announced they still planned to move forward with a second trial, pushing the theory that Kenneth and Chadwick had committed the murder together. In the end, though, Chadwick's trial never actually happened, because in February 2025, he entered what's known as a no-contest plea, essentially telling the court that he wouldn't fight the charges, but he wasn't going to admit guilt either. He told the judge that he'd been extremely drunk the night Andrea was killed and had no memory of what happened, though he didn't deny his involvement. During that same hearing, a disturbing fact came to light. Some officers had, in fact, looked at Chadwick as a suspect in the very early days of the investigation. But for reasons no one could explain, he never officially made it into the case file. By then, detectives were already fixated on Kenneth, despite the DNA mismatch and the missing murder weapon. In the end, Chadwick was sentenced to life without parole. He also turned to Andrea's family in court and apologized for what he'd done. For Kenneth, though, nothing changed. His attorney immediately demanded that the charges be dropped, but prosecutors flat out refused. They argued that Chadwick's conviction didn't erase Kenneth's alleged role and vowed to move ahead with a second trial. Chadwick himself stated that he didn't know Kenneth or Andrea and had no accomplice, but the state pressed on. That second trial is now set for January 2026, while Kenneth remains stuck under house arrest. Meanwhile, his defense team has secured a well-known forensic expert who reviewed the bloody hair on Kenneth's pants and confirmed what the earlier report suggested, that it could only have landed there a few hours after Andrea's death, not during the crime. Taken together, the DNA, the murder weapon, Chadwick's conviction, and the forensic analysis, Kenneth has a strong chance of finally clearing his name. But the damage has already been done. 14 years of his life have been basically lost. He spent years in prison and years locked inside his own home. Even if the courts recognize his innocence, he'll never get that time back. And if he decides to fight for justice against the officers and prosecutors who did it to him, it could take many more years, with no guarantee he'll ever truly be made whole. Ardith Wood was born on October 28, 1975, in St. John, Canada. Not long after, she became a big sister to two younger brothers, and the family eventually moved to Ottawa. That's where Ardith went through Catholic school and later enrolled in university, diving into history and philosophy. After earning her degrees, she decided to keep going and enrolled at another university near Toronto to pursue a PhD in philosophy. Ardith was genuinely passionate about it and pictured herself teaching at a top university one day. Her professors often remarked on her exceptional talent. In fact, at times they felt like they were talking to a colleague rather than a student. Outside the classroom, she was active and athletic. She loved swimming, running, and cycling. She also dreamed of having a big family, and she was in a serious relationship, planning to marry her boyfriend after finishing her PhD. In the summer of 2003, when she was 27, Ardith decided to visit her family in Ottawa and spend 2 weeks with them. Her university was about 300 miles away from home, so she didn't get to see her loved ones very often. Since they were such a close-knit family, being apart for that long was tough on her, and she planned to spend as much time with them as possible during her break. On the morning of August 6th, Ardith got up early and went for a run. When she came back, she made a strawberry dessert for her parents and brothers. Later that day, she and her mom were planning to go shopping, but the forecast warned that heavy rain was on the way. So, Ardith decided to head out for a bike ride while the weather was still holding up. She promised her mom she'd be back in about an hour and a half, borrowed her brother's bike, and rode off. An hour and a half later, the rain the forecast had promised finally came pouring down, but Ardith still hadn't returned. Her mom figured she'd gotten caught in the storm and was probably waiting it out under some kind of shelter. But as time passed, the rain stopped, and Ardith was still nowhere to be seen. Worried, her mom called her husband, who quickly went out with their sons to search for her. They drove along the city's Long Park Trail, a popular spot for cyclists. As kids, Ardith and her brothers had spent countless hours biking there, so her family assumed that's where she might have gone. But it was only a guess. Before leaving, Ardith hadn't told anyone exactly where she planned to ride, and her father and brothers couldn't find any trace of her. By then, it was already starting to get dark, and her family was in a panic. More than 6 hours had passed since she'd left the house, and they were almost certain something bad had happened. They decided it was time to call the police. But the local police department didn't launch a full search right away, since Ardith was 27 years old. Her family, though, refused to just sit around and wait. They started calling friends and neighbors, asking them to help. Dozens of people joined the search, combing through bike trails all over the city late into the night. Still, there was no sign of Ardith. The biggest problem was that Ottawa's bike paths stretched more than 100 miles, and no one knew which route she had taken. All they could do was guess that she'd chosen the closest one to home. The next morning, police finally joined the search and set up a command post at the Aviation Museum, a spot where several major bike trails intersected. They brought in dozens of officers and also reached out to the public for help. Photos of Ardith were handed out to newspapers and TV stations, and volunteers were urged to join the search. The community's response was overwhelming. Within just hours, hundreds of locals joined the search. Mounted police showed up, along with helicopters and even the military. Very quickly, the search for Ardith became one of the biggest in Ottawa's history. But, despite the massive effort, there was still no trace of her. News of Ardith's disappearance spread quickly across the city, and soon police were flooded with hundreds of calls and tips. In the very first days, several women came forward with eerily similar stories. Each of them said they'd been approached by a man, and from their descriptions, it sounded like the same guy every time. They explained that he would approach them on bike paths or park trails that ran along the river, not far from the very spot where police had set up their command post. One woman told officers that he rode up to her on a bike, and at first he seemed very nice. He was fit, good-looking, and started off with casual small talk. But then, out of nowhere, he tried to pull her off her bike and drag her into the trees. Terrified, she managed to break free and sped away. Based on her account, police were able to create a composite sketch of the suspect, but they decided not to release it to the public. They were already overwhelmed with tips, and without solid evidence to connect him to Ardith's disappearance, putting out the sketch would only create even more noise. Even if someone recognized him and gave them a name, they'd have no way to prove the link. So, they held off. But in the following days, more women came forward with nearly identical stories. A man matching the same description approached them in local parks, acted strangely, and in some cases even tried to drag them off the trail into the woods. Another lead came from a 16-year-old girl who had been riding her bike in the park. She told police that she'd seen Ardith's photo on the news and immediately recognized her because she'd actually spotted her in the park on the day she vanished. According to the teen, she rode past Ardith, but just a few seconds later heard a woman scream. When she turned around, she saw Ardith standing with a man, and it looked like they were arguing. She kept going, but when she looked back again, she saw the man walking into the woods with Ardith beside him. Something about it didn't feel right, so she circled back. By the time she returned, though, they were gone. Curious but uneasy, she went a little further into the trees. First, she noticed a hat hanging on a branch. Then, just a few steps later, she came across 2 bikes lying on the ground. But there was no sign of Ardith or the man, and at that point, she decided not to go any deeper. She convinced herself she might just be overthinking things, that maybe she'd only witnessed a couple having an argument. As she rode away, though, she thought she heard another scream. She couldn't be sure if it was real or if her mind was playing tricks on her. When police later showed her the composite sketch created from the other women's descriptions, she confirmed that it looked a lot like the man she saw with Ardith that day. This pushed detectives towards the theory that Ardith had been abducted, and now they had a better idea of where it might have happened. They swept through the park with hundreds of volunteers, and even brought in divers to search the long, narrow river running through the area. 4 days after Ardith went missing, the effort finally paid off. Divers pulled a bike from the bottom of the river, and the serial number confirmed it belonged to Ardith's brother. At that point, detectives realized the chances of finding her alive were slim, and they shifted all their focus to the riverbanks. That same day, police got a call unlike any of the tips they'd received before. On the other end of the line was a man who sounded panicked. He said he had accidentally killed Ardith near a bike path. According to him, it wasn't planned, it was some kind of accident. He went on to say that afterward, he partially buried her body near the riverbank and covered it with branches. Investigators traced the call and learned it had come from a payphone in a nearby town. They rushed to the scene, hoping the caller might have left behind fingerprints or DNA on the phone. But once again, they came up empty. Meanwhile, police brought in search dogs to comb both sides of the river where Ardith's bike had turned up. And the very next day, the dogs led them to a body lying just a few feet from the water, partially hidden under branches. The decomposition was so advanced that investigators couldn't identify it by sight, and there were no clothes on it. But they knew almost instantly it had to be Ardith. They turned the remains over to medical examiners and combed the crime scene, but there was nothing. No footprints, no belongings, nothing that could point them toward a suspect. Later, medical experts confirmed the victim was Ardith. They determined she had drowned, most likely held underwater until she died. Afterward, her killer dragged her onto the riverbank and tried to cover her with branches. Since police couldn't find any of her clothing, it was clear the killer had taken it with him. Examiners couldn't say for sure if Ardith had been sexually assaulted, but everything about the scene pointed strongly in that direction. After Ardith's body was found, investigators decided to release the composite sketch of the suspect, and it triggered a flood of new tips. Many women said a man matching that description had harassed them in local parks, but none of it brought police closer to putting a name to the face. Over time, detectives built a list of several hundred possible suspects, checking each one carefully, but still couldn't tie anyone directly to Ardith's murder. They also looked into the possibility that a serial offender was responsible, the same man who had assaulted several women in the nearby town where the confession call to police had come from. That predator had attacked multiple women just a year earlier and was never caught. Detectives tried hard to link the two cases, but once again, they hit a dead end. Even so, tips kept flooding in, and investigators were struck by how many women had run into a man who looked like the composite sketch. But when they pieced it all together, they realized he'd been spotted in that very park at least 19 times in the week before Ardith disappeared. Even more chilling, one woman saw him the day after the murder, before Ardith's body had been discovered. Detectives believed he might have returned to the scene to hide the body better, or to collect evidence before police could find it. There was one more detail witnesses kept bringing up. Many of them said the man had an eagle tattoo on his shoulder. At first, detectives kept that information to themselves, because it was their strongest lead. But as the weeks dragged on and they were no closer to making an arrest, they decided to release it to the public. As a result, hundreds of calls came in about men with similar tattoos. Detectives followed up on every single one, but once again, it led nowhere. In the months that followed, detectives kept working through the flood of tips, more than 4,000 in total. They tried to chase down every lead, which was an overwhelming task. Eventually, though, two specific calls caught their attention. One came in shortly after Ardith's body was found, and the other arrived months later. But both callers pointed to the same man, a local who lived in the same town where the confession call had been made from that payphone. In fact, he lived in the very neighborhood where that payphone stood. On top of that, he had a criminal record, and he had a bird tattoo on his shoulder that matched what witnesses described. Detectives brought him in for questioning, and his behavior was strange. At one point, he even told them they'd never figure out what he was doing on the day Ardith was killed, because he was as elusive as a scorpion. Investigators grilled him for 3 hours, but he gave them nothing useful. So they called him back for a second interview, this time with a polygraph. By then, detectives were nearly convinced this was their guy, but the results completely blindsided them. The polygraph examiner didn't flag a single lie. With no hard evidence to hold the suspect on, detectives had no choice but to let him go. And the clean polygraph results left them questioning whether he was really their suspect after all. Over time, the flood of tips finally dried up, but detectives kept going through the old ones, one by one. A year after the murder, their lead investigator told reporters that they were still working through their suspect list, which had around 400 men on it. Most had already been ruled out, but a chunk of them were still question marks. Police also put up a $50,000 reward, the biggest ever put up in Ottawa at the time. But not even that was enough to bring them any closer to finding the killer. By the 2-year mark, detectives had run out of leads, and the case basically went cold. That's how it stayed until September 2005, when another young woman vanished in Ottawa. 18-year-old Jennifer Teague, whose story we've already covered on this channel. Investigators immediately looked for a possible link, since the two cases seemed so similar. But in the end, no connection was ever found. After that, the case sat cold for almost another year, and detectives were beginning to doubt they'd ever solve it. They had no physical evidence, and despite all the eyewitness accounts, they still couldn't put a name to the mysterious man seen in the park. But then, on May 2006, everything suddenly changed. Police in North Bay, a city about 190 miles from Ottawa, got a call from an attempted assault. A woman reported that she was walking home late at night when a man approached her and asked if he could walk with her. She said no and kept going, but he followed, claiming he needed help. He told her he had just moved from Ottawa and couldn't find the address he was looking for. As she started giving him directions, the man suddenly grabbed her and dragged her into the bushes. He tried to assault her, but the woman screamed and nearby residents heard it. One man even ran outside with a shovel and scared the attacker off. The suspect bolted, dropping his phone as he ran. That mistake cost him dearly. Police quickly tracked him down and arrested him. The man was 25-year-old Christopher Myers, who had only recently moved to North Bay from Ottawa. While preparing the case against him, the lead detective suddenly remembered hearing about the Ardith Wood case at a police conference. He dug out the handouts from that event, and among them was a composite sketch of the suspect. The resemblance to Christopher was uncanny. He immediately passed the tip on to investigators in Ottawa, who started taking a closer look at Myers. The first thing they realized was that police had actually spoken to Christopher in the early weeks after Ardith's disappearance. An anonymous tipster had called the hotline and named him as a suspect. Detectives had checked him out, but found nothing solid linking him to the crime. He even seemed to have an alibi. The woman who rented him a room said she'd seen him earlier in the day, and by 3 p.m., he had already left for his work shift. Since Ardith was believed to have been attacked around 1:30, it seemed likely he simply wouldn't have had the time to be in the park. About a year later, Christopher's name popped up again when another tip came in. This time, police decided to take a closer look at him and brought him in for questioning. He denied having anything to do with Ardith's murder, and even showed them his shoulders to prove he had no tattoos, something that made detectives doubt whether he really was their guy. But now, with Christopher back on their radar for the third time, and given the fact that he had just tried to drag another woman into the bushes, detectives started seeing him as their prime suspect. The problem was, they still needed hard evidence to prove it. The first thing they did was revisit his alibi. Originally, his landlady had told police she saw him at home during the day, which seemed to clear him. But when investigators went back and spoke with her again, she clarified that she had actually seen him in the morning. That small detail changed everything. It meant that he had plenty of time to ride his bike from his house to the park, attack Ardith, and still make it to his afternoon shift. To be sure, police even retraced the entire route by bike themselves and confirmed it was absolutely possible. Eventually, detectives went to the neighboring city to question Christopher. At first, he flat out denied having anything to do with it, but when they told him that multiple women had spotted him in the park, his story started to change. He admitted he'd been riding his bike there that day, and even claimed he ran into Ardith and struck up a conversation with her. According to Christopher, after a brief chat, Ardith supposedly agreed to walk with him into the woods by the river. But then, he claimed, another girl appeared, spooking Ardith and causing her to fall into the water. He said he left right away, but later came back, only to find her already drowned. That's when he claimed he pulled her body onto the shore, covered it with branches, and simply walked away without telling anyone what had happened. Detectives knew the story was complete nonsense, but at the same time, Christopher had just admitted to having contact with Ardith on the day of the murder. What's more, the other girl in his tale sounded a lot like the 16-year-old witness who reported hearing a scream and spotting Ardith with a man before they vanished into the woods. It seemed like Christopher had taken her account from the news and twisted it into his own version. Not long after, he backtracked again, saying the whole story was a lie. He claimed he had never been in the park at all, that he had only heard about Ardith's case from the news, and made everything up based on publicly available details. Detectives then put him on a polygraph, and he failed. Even so, Christopher kept insisting he was innocent, and without solid physical evidence, police couldn't charge him with murder. While Christopher was still behind bars in the neighboring city, detectives started digging into his past, hoping to uncover anything that could tie him to Ardith's murder. They learned that his mother had been drinking and using drugs while pregnant, which left Christopher with mental health issues from an early age. To make matters worse, she physically abused him until, at age 4, he was adopted by another family. But 8 years later, even they gave up on him. His behavior had become deeply disturbing and impossible to manage. He talked to himself constantly, stripped naked in public, and grew more aggressive with each passing year. One psychologist who treated him even said Christopher was the most frightening child he had ever worked with. On the surface, his adult life looked more stable. He managed to hold a job, find housing, and mostly stayed off the police radar, aside from a few related arrests. He even had girlfriends, and detectives tracked some of them down to ask about his past. One ex described how Christopher would frequently fly into rages and sometimes hit her. She also confirmed that he was always riding his bike around parks, but then she told detectives something that stunned them. Christopher had a habit of giving himself temporary tattoos, and more than once, she'd seen an eagle tattoo inked onto his shoulder. This information became the missing piece of the puzzle, the final detail that convinced detectives Christopher really was their guy. Up until then, the tattoo could have blown the whole case apart. If he really hadn't had it, every eyewitness account would have fallen flat. But with a witness now confirming he did have that eagle tattoo on his shoulder, detectives knew they weren't chasing shadows anymore. Still, it wasn't nearly enough to bring the case to trial. What they needed was a confession. 5 months after his arrest for the attempted assault, detectives brought him back in for questioning, this time with backup. They invited in an experienced investigator from the UK, someone with a reputation for getting people to talk. At first, Christopher flat out denied having anything to do with Ardith's murder, but later he slipped back into the same story he told before, the one about meeting her by the river, kissing her, and then claiming she drowned after another girl startled her. Then, just as quickly, he took it all back. But not long after, he drew detectives a map showing where he said he first met Ardith and the spot where they supposedly went together. He even agreed to take them out there and point everything out in person. But once they actually arrived, Christopher suddenly changed his tune again, saying he didn't recognize the park at all. So, while his story wasn't a full confession, it was just enough to keep him on the hook. But detectives had something else up their sleeve. They believed Christopher might not only be tied to Ardith's murder, but also to a string of unsolved sexual assaults that had happened around Ottawa at the very same time. The pattern was always the same. A man would approach women on the street, strike up a conversation, then suddenly attack and sexually assault them. When police spoke to the victims and showed them Christopher's photo, several of them confirmed without hesitation he was the one who attacked them. Armed with this, detectives hauled him in for another round of questioning. This time, after hours of pressure, Christopher finally broke and admitted to 5 separate assaults. That confession gave police what they needed, additional charges, and, combined with everything else, a much stronger case against him for Ardith's murder. In the end, Christopher was finally charged with murder, and the case went to trial. It took years to get there, but in January 2008, prosecutors put a deal on the table. If he pled guilty, they dropped the charge from first-degree to second-degree murder. In the end, Christopher took the deal. He admitted that he approached Ardith on the bike path, dragged her into the woods with the intent to assault her, and then drowned her in the river. He also pled guilty to several other attacks on women. For all of this, he got a life sentence, but with the possibility of parole after just 10 years. That leniency was part of the plea deal, though it didn't mean he'd actually walk free. His first chance at parole came in 2015, but the board flat out denied it. 5 years later, in 2020, he tried again and was turned down once more. This time, experts made it clear, even after 15 years behind bars, he was still considered highly likely to reoffend. As of today, Christopher is still in prison, and it's unlikely he'll ever walk free. Ardith Wood's murder became one of the most infamous cases in Ottawa's history, leaving deep scars on the community. For years afterward, women were terrified to walk in parks or ride their bikes alone. Locals even organized volunteer patrols along the bike paths, groups of people riding together to watch over each other and prevent anything like this from happening again. And one last note. While Christopher admitted to several assaults, detectives were convinced he had committed many more. The issue was that not all of his victims ever saw his face, which made it impossible to tie him directly to every case. Alicia Ross was born on February 8, 1980, in Markham, Ontario. When she was just a baby, she was adopted by a couple who surrounded her with love and care. Later, her parents divorced, and Alicia stayed with her mom, but she still saw her dad regularly. She loved being outdoors, and her biggest passion was canoeing. She would often head out to Lake Ontario, where she could spend hours paddling across the open water. Eventually, she even started teaching kids how to canoe at local camps. After finishing school, Alicia got a job in sales at HP's Canadian branch, where she quickly proved herself as hardworking and reliable. At the time, she was still living with her mom, who had since remarried. Together with Alicia's stepdad, they converted the basement into a full apartment with its own entrance, so Alicia could stay close to her family while still having her own independence. On August 16, 2005, 25-year-old Alicia went out for an evening walk with her mom and their dogs. Alicia was in great spirits. She had just found out she was getting a promotion the next day. She shared the news with her mom, who wasn't the least bit surprised, knowing how seriously Alicia took her career. When they got back home, Alicia's boyfriend Sean stopped by to congratulate her. They spent a few hours together, and around midnight, he headed home. The next day, around noon, Sean called the police to report Alicia missing. He explained that when he got home the night before, he tried calling her, but she didn't answer. He figured she'd already gone to bed and didn't think much of it. But when she didn't pick up the phone the following morning either, he started to worry. Sean drove over to her place and saw that her car was still parked outside. That immediately struck him as odd. Alicia should have been at work hours ago, especially since it was the day she was supposed to get promoted. He knocked on her door, but no one answered. So he walked around to the back of the house and noticed the gate standing wide open. Lying on the grass were Alicia's shoes, an empty cup, and a pack of cigarettes. That was enough to send him into full panic mode, so he decided to call the police right away. After that, Sean called Alicia's mom, and she and her husband rushed back home. By the time they arrived, several police cars were already outside. Officers went through the house, but found no sign of Alicia. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, but detectives noticed something deeply unsettling. It looked like Alicia had never gone to bed the night before. Her bed was neatly made. Freshly washed clothes she had planned to put away were still sitting out, and in the bathroom was her ring, the one she always took off before going to sleep. On top of that, all of her belongings, including her keys and purse, were still on the table. Police quickly confirmed she hadn't shown up for work and officially opened a missing person investigation. Detectives quickly concluded that Alicia hadn't just walked away from home. This looked much more like an abduction. Even though there were no real clues inside the house, her shoes lying by the open gate pointed towards something sinister. And since it looked like Alicia never went to bed that night, investigators believed she may have been taken right after her boyfriend left. Sean got home and called her just 15 minutes later, but by then she wasn't answering. It seemed as if someone had grabbed her the moment she stepped outside to see him off, right there by that open gate. Alicia's mom hadn't heard anything unusual, and canvassing the neighbors turned up no leads either. With no other direction, police turned their attention to Sean, the most obvious suspect. He was the last person to see her, but detectives struggled to find any motive. The two had only been dating for about a month and a half, and everyone close to Alicia said the relationship was going smoothly. Police searched Sean's car and home, but found nothing suspicious. They also spoke with his neighbors, asking if they had noticed anything odd, like him taking out the trash in the middle of the night, but that led nowhere too. Eventually, detectives started to doubt his involvement. They dug into Alicia's circle of friends and acquaintances, but no one stood out as suspicious. So, detectives launched a massive search operation, setting up a command post inside a local school while the kids were away on summer break. They brought in search dogs, helicopters, and asked the public for help. On the very first day, around 60 people joined in, but by the next day, the number had grown to nearly 400. The response was so overwhelming that police actually had to send some volunteers home because they didn't have enough resources to manage such a huge group. Even so, the search for Alicia quickly became the largest in Ontario's history, and the story spread far beyond Canada's borders. There were a few reasons why the case grabbed so much attention. First, no one could understand how Alicia could vanish from her own backyard in a matter of minutes, with no sounds, no witnesses, and no real clues. And second, from the very beginning, a lot of people pointed the finger at her boyfriend, convinced he had somehow pulled off the perfect crime. One detail that especially fueled suspicion was the fact that Sean called the police almost immediately after Alicia didn't pick up her phone. He had her mother's number, but instead of calling her first to check if she knew where Alicia was, he went straight to the police. About a week and a half after Alicia vanished, the media reported that Sean had refused to take a polygraph test and had stopped cooperating with the police, news that only fueled suspicions against him. Reporters also spoke with him directly, and he admitted that he believed he was now the prime suspect in the case. Meanwhile, the search was going nowhere. Police set up a hotline and got hundreds of calls, but not a single one brought them any closer to finding Alicia. Eventually, detectives had no choice but to call off the search operation and shut down the command post, since the school they were using had to reopen as summer break was ending. A month went by, and investigators still couldn't find a single new lead. They looked into ex-convicts living in the area, interviewed hundreds of Alicia's neighbors, spoke with her coworkers, but every path hit a dead end. At that point, detectives were leaning toward the idea that whoever kidnapped her must have known her personally. That would explain why no one ever heard her scream. That's how things stayed until September 20th, when the case suddenly took a shocking turn. A man walked into the police station with his lawyer and announced that he was the one who had killed Alicia Ross. The man was 31-year-old Daniel Sylvester, Alicia's neighbor, living just a few feet from her house. He said that around 1:30 a.m., he went outside for a walk and stepped into the narrow alleyway between their homes. That's where he ran into Alicia. Seeing him there in the middle of the night startled her, and she asked what he was doing. Daniel told her he had every right to stand outside his own house. An argument broke out, and according to Daniel, when Alicia insulted him, he completely lost control. He punched her, knocking her to the ground, and then kept hitting her as she tried to fight back. Enraged, he slammed her head against the stone walkway several times until she stopped moving. That's when he realized she wasn't breathing, and that he had killed her. As he confessed, Daniel even lay down on the floor in front of detectives, physically acting out how he had beaten her to death. Panicking, he froze for a few minutes, not knowing what to do next. Then he made a decision. He had to get rid of the body. He dragged Alicia into his garage, washed the blood off the walkway with a garden hose, and lined the trunk of his mother's car with cardboard. His mom, by the way, was asleep inside the house at the time. He then stripped both himself and Alicia, stuffed the clothes into trash bags, and wrapped her head in rags and duct tape to stop the blood before loading her into the trunk. After that, Daniel went back home, took a shower, and changed into clean clothes. Around 5 a.m., he got into his mother's car and drove about an hour out to a small town called Manila. He found some remote swampy area and dumped Alicia's body, along with the trash bags containing their blood-stained clothes. When he returned home, he suddenly realized that along with his clothes, he had also accidentally thrown out his own wallet with all of his bank cards and driver's license. Over the next few days, Daniel kept going back to the site, desperately trying to find the bag, but he had hidden it so well that he couldn't locate the exact spot again. Still, he remembered exactly where he had left Alicia's body, since he'd stashed it separately. A few weeks later, panic started creeping in. He was terrified the police would eventually find it, so he went back to move the remains. By that point, the body was badly decomposed, and he had to gather the remains piece by piece. He wrapped them in a tarp, put them in the trunk, and drove about 40 minutes away to a tiny town called Coboconk. There, he found a secluded spot in the woods and hid the body again. Afterward, Daniel confessed that he pleasured himself to ease the tension, but swore he never touched Alicia in a sexual way and that this was never his motive. After finishing his confession, Daniel said he never meant to kill Alicia, but his rage took over and he just couldn't stop himself. One of the detectives told him he should write a letter to Alicia's parents and apologize for what he'd done. Daniel broke down in tears, admitted he had no right to take their daughter away, and scribbled a short apology on a piece of paper. He also said he deeply regretted the pain he had caused his own mother, knowing she would now have to live the rest of her life carrying the shame of his actions. After Daniel's confession, detectives asked him to show them to the spot where he had hidden the body, and sure enough, they found Alicia's remains there. Because of how badly decomposed the body was, experts couldn't determine the exact cause of death, but they did confirm that at least 30 of her bones had been broken. They also discovered that not all of the remains were in that location, suggesting Daniel had left part of them at the first site. Right after that, he was placed under arrest, and the news sent shockwaves through the community. Throughout the entire investigation, Daniel had never once been considered a suspect, even though he lived literally right next door. Soon, more details about him began surfacing in the media. Daniel had no criminal record, but he had struggled with anxiety and depression since childhood. He had a hard time interacting with other people, which made him an easy target for constant bullying. He also struggled with women, so grew up withdrawn and isolated. As an adult, Daniel spent nearly all of his time at home. None of his neighbors really knew him, and even Alicia's mother admitted she had only seen him just a few times over the years, and only in passing. In the end, Daniel was charged with second-degree murder, though his defense pushed for manslaughter, so the case went to trial. The proceedings began in May 2007, almost 2 years after Alicia's death. Prosecutors argued that Daniel had fully intended to kill her, and that the original charge should stand. In their view, he could have been watching Alicia for a long time. After all, she lived just a few feet away. They suggested he might have spied on her through her window, and that over time, this turned into an unhealthy obsession. That night, when Alicia was standing outside alone, Daniel likely saw an opportunity to approach her, but instead, he frightened her by sneaking up in the dark alleyway. The prosecution emphasized that Daniel had countless chances to stop while he was attacking her, yet he chose not to. Then, instead of calling police, he decided to hide the body, spending the entire night cleaning up and getting rid of evidence. Weeks later, he even went back to move the remains so investigators would have a harder time finding them. Because of all this, the prosecution believed Daniel wasn't motivated by guilt when he confessed, but by fear of being caught. After all, he had tossed out his wallet and ID in the same bag as Alicia's bloody clothing. Sooner or later, someone would have found it and tied him directly to the crime. For that reason, prosecutors insisted he deserved to be convicted of second-degree murder. His lawyer tried to convince the jury that Daniel never meant to kill Alicia, that it all happened in the heat of the moment. According to the defense, Daniel lost control after she insulted him and wasn't thinking clearly about what he was doing. They also pointed to his lifelong struggles, constant bullying that left him with low self-esteem, as well as anxiety and depression that had followed him into adulthood. But then, something came out during the trial that didn't do him any favors. A psychiatrist who had evaluated Daniel before court testified that Daniel had admitted to violent fantasies about women. For example, he imagined jumping out of the bushes and attacking them. And he also confessed that he sometimes exposed himself to strangers on the street. That revelation pushed the jury even further toward believing that Daniel likely had planned to kill Alicia. In the end, he was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 16 years. After the verdict, Daniel tried to appeal his sentence, but nothing came of it. His first chance to apply for parole came in 2021, but there's no record of him being released. Since there's no public information suggesting otherwise, it's most likely that he's still behind bars. It's also worth noting that shortly after Daniel's arrest, a local newspaper issued a public apology to Alicia's boyfriend, Sean. For an entire month, many media outlets had painted him as the prime suspect, and according to Sean's father, that time was devastating for him. Not only had he lost his girlfriend, but countless people believed he was a killer who had gotten away with it. After Daniel was sentenced, Alicia's parents created a memorial fund in her name, It helped sponsor canoe lessons for kids at the national park she loved so much. Lauren Giddings was born on April 18, 1984, in Tacoma Park, Maryland. She grew up in a loving family, with caring parents and 2 younger sisters she was especially close to. From a young age, Lauren had a deep faith and a strong desire to help others. That's why she chose to become a public defender, someone who stands up for people who can't afford a lawyer. To make that dream a reality, she enrolled at Mercer University and moved to Macon, Georgia. Lauren excelled in her studies and even became president of Mercer's chapter of the Federalist Society. She later landed an internship at a law firm in Atlanta, where she met a man named David, and the two soon started dating. After she returned to Macon, they kept their relationship going long distance and planned to get married once Lauren finished law school. In the summer of 2011, when Lauren was 27, she finally graduated, but there was still one big milestone ahead: the bar exam. She spent weeks preparing for it, taking a short break only to attend her younger sister's wedding back home in Maryland. After the celebration, she returned to Georgia and joined her classmates for a small end-of-year party. Not long after that, she told her friends and family she was going to spend the next few days completely focused on studying and asked them not to disturb her. From that moment on, no one heard from Lauren. At first, her friends and family assumed she was just busy preparing for the exam. But a few days later, on June 29th, her sister started to worry. She was on her honeymoon at the time and had been sending her photos from the trip, but Lauren hadn't opened a single message. Her sister knew Lauren was focused on studying, but the fact that she hadn't even read the messages for days felt unsettling. Worried, she reached out to one of Lauren's friends and asked her to check if everything was okay. The friend tried calling first, but the calls went straight to voicemail. So, she and her boyfriend decided to drive over to Lauren's apartment, a small student housing complex right across from the university. The first thing they noticed was that Lauren's car was still parked outside, but when they knocked, no one answered. Her friend had a spare key, so after a moment's hesitation, she decided to let herself in. Inside, the place was a mess, but that wasn't necessarily alarming. Lauren was supposed to move in with her boyfriend David the very next day, so there were bags and suitcases scattered everywhere. But Lauren herself was nowhere to be found. On the other hand, her purse, phone, even laptop were still there. None of it made any sense. Where could she have gone, leaving behind all of her things, and even her car? The friends started calling around, reaching out to people who knew Lauren, and soon, several of them joined the search. They combed the university grounds and nearby streets, but there was no sign of her. They also learned that no one had seen or spoken to Lauren for days. When her family found out what was happening, they drove from Maryland to Georgia to help. Meanwhile, her friends kept searching through the night, but when morning came and there was still no trace of her, they finally decided to call the police. Officers arrived at the apartment complex and searched Lauren's unit, but they didn't find any signs of forced entry or a struggle. Still, her sudden disappearance seemed deeply suspicious, so they called in forensic specialists to process the scene. The team began spraying luminol around the apartment, looking for traces of blood. At first, nothing unusual showed up, but the moment they reached the bathroom, the luminol lit up almost the entire tub. It was clear that a large amount of blood had been cleaned up there. From that point on, detectives feared the worst. There was just too much blood for anyone to still be alive, so investigators quickly shifted their focus to finding Lauren's body. While officers were standing outside, one of them caught a strong, foul odor, one he instantly recognized as the smell of decomposition. Following the scent, he walked toward the apartment complex's dumpsters. The closer he got, the stronger the stench became. And when he finally lifted the lid on one of them, he saw a large black garbage bag, and inside that bag was a woman's torso. Although the victim's identity couldn't be confirmed visually, since her head was missing, detectives were almost certain it was Lauren. Still, they decided to keep the discovery quiet for the moment, not wanting to jeopardize the investigation. It's worth noting that finding the remains was pure luck. The officer had arrived at the complex just minutes before the garbage truck was scheduled to pick up the trash, and they'd parked their cars in a way that blocked the truck from entering. If not for that small coincidence, the body would have been taken to the landfill and most likely never found. As detectives waited for confirmation of the victim's identity and tried to figure out their next steps, they learned something that immediately caught their attention. Lauren's friends and family told them she'd been complaining for weeks about strange things happening in her apartment. She said that sometimes, when she came home, it felt like someone had moved her belongings around, but there were no signs of a break-in, and the door was always locked. This had been going on for quite a while, to the point where Lauren started wondering if she was losing her mind. On top of that, she sometimes felt like someone was watching her, though she never actually saw anyone. Growing increasingly uneasy, she even bought a door security bar to brace the door from the inside. But the strange things didn't stop. Shortly before she disappeared, Lauren had told her boyfriend about it. He tried to calm her down, suggesting it was probably just some pranksters fooling around and that she had nothing to worry about. Police quickly looked into her boyfriend David and found that he'd been out of state during the time of the murder. There was no way he could have done it, so they ruled him out almost immediately. Meanwhile, forensic investigators combed through Lauren's apartment, looking for fingerprints or any other trace evidence, but it looked as if someone had done a meticulous cleaning job. Every surface seemed freshly wiped down with cleaning products. In hopes of finding something, they decided to remove the entire bathtub and send it to the lab for DNA testing. Not long after, medical examiners confirmed that the torso found in the dumpster was indeed Lauren's, officially turning the case into a homicide. They estimated that she'd been killed around June 26, roughly 3 days before her friends and family started looking for her. However, the exact cause of death couldn't be determined, and there were no signs of sexual assault. Despite detectives' efforts to keep the investigation under wraps, the sudden police activity drew attention from reporters. Soon, journalists were gathering outside the apartment complex, filming news segments and spreading rumors that the police had found a body, even though, officially, no one had confirmed that yet. Detectives decided to question everyone living in the complex and check their apartments, just in case the killer was someone who lived right next door. All of the residents, who were also Mercer Law students, immediately agreed to let the police in without a warrant. All except one, 25-year-old Stephen McDaniel. Stephen lived right next door to Lauren, but he flat out refused to let officers into his apartment. He told them that, as a law student, he strongly believed in protecting his privacy, and that he had nothing to hide. Naturally, that raised a lot of red flags for investigators. They started looking into him and quickly learned that Stephen had actually been helping with the search for Lauren the previous day, and that he'd even given an interview to reporters earlier that morning. He wasn't just some random neighbor. He'd been her classmate, a fellow law student, and even served as vice president of the same student law society where Lauren was president. So yes, he knew her very well, but for some reason, he was refusing to let police see his apartment. And yet, he stayed right in the middle of everything happening around the complex, hovering near officers, chatting with other residents, and talking to journalists. During the interview, Stephen told reporters how he and a few of Lauren's friends had gone into her apartment and searched the neighborhood, trying to find her. But while talking about Lauren, he started referring to her in the past tense, even though, at that point, no one yet knew for sure she was dead.
Yeah, Lauren was my neighbor. We're just trying to find out where she is at this point. I mean, no one has seen her since Saturday. I mean, the last time anyone heard from her was an email that she sent out, and no one's heard from her since.
Did you see her hang out with anyone at the time, anything like that?
I mean, no one has seen her since Saturday. I haven't seen anything. I mean, you always hear noise outside, but it's just people walking by pretty much.
And she just recently graduated from Mercer?
Yeah, she and I we were both JD students. We graduated back in May.
What kind of person was she? I mean, what did you see?
I mean, she's as nice as can be. I mean, very personable, very much a people person.
Do you know any enemies she might have had, somebody that might want to hurt her?
No, we don't know where she is. I mean, the only thing we can think is that maybe she went out running and someone snatched her. Because we went over. One of her friends had a key. We went inside. and tried to see if there was anything amiss, but I mean, she had a door jamb that was sitting right by it, so there was no sign that anyone broke in. I mean, the door was locked when everyone got here. I mean, we just don't know where she is.
When the reporters mentioned that police might have found a body near the dumpsters, Stephen went completely silent. His face changed instantly. He froze, staring off into space, not saying a word. The journalist kept talking, asking if he was okay, and after a few seconds, Stephen quietly said he needed to sit down.
What about in the parking lot area? I know they've been doing a lot of, I think that's where they have recovered the body or whatever they recovered from there.
Body?
Had you seen anything there? Had you seen anything there? I mean, we don't know if this is the same person. You know what I mean? Like, they took out a body there earlier. We don't know if it's the same person or not. So that's why we're trying to ask people if they know who lived there. Are you okay, sir?
I think I need to sit down.
Okay.
Eventually, he resumed the interview, trying to answer questions again, though now he was acting very dramatic.
I mean, I don't know anyone that would want to hurt her. She was as nice a person as there is.
What's going on in your mind right now? Like, what are you thinking?
Why would anyone do this?
Didn't hear anything?
No.
Didn't see anybody?
I just heard something. Maybe I could have helped.
It's okay, don't worry. Do you want to sit down for a second?
And after the reporters left, Stephen just sat there for a long time, completely still, staring off into the distance. A few hours later, Stephen suddenly changed his mind and told police they could search his apartment after all. The moment detectives stepped inside, they were hit with what looked like organized chaos. Large piles of canned food, energy drinks, random junk, and a lot of weapons. But what really caught their attention came next. Hidden among his things were 2 keys, a master key that could open any door in the complex, and another one, a duplicate that fit Lauren's apartment specifically. When they confronted him, Stephen admitted that he'd broken into several neighboring units when the tenants weren't home, and in one case, he'd stolen a box of condoms. Strangely, he added that he was a virgin, but he never explained why he took them in the first place. Detectives decided to use that confession to their advantage. They arrested him for burglary and took him down to the station for questioning. Meanwhile, officers continued searching his apartment, and that's when they found an empty hacksaw package. Considering the killer had dismembered the victim, this discovery sent an immediate chill through the room. But the deeper they looked, the worse it got. Police found 2 USB drives filled with illegal material involving minors, along with a pair of women's underwear hidden in the closet. When investigators checked his computer, they discovered that Stephen had been visiting Lauren's social media pages obsessively. At the same time, his browser history showed he'd been consuming violent and disturbing adult content, sometimes while looking at Lauren's photos. And even that wasn't the end of it. Detectives found links to online forums where Stephen had been writing graphic stories about murdering and torturing women. And one of the final searches in his browser history was the trash collection schedule for their city. All of this convinced detectives beyond any doubt that Stephen was involved in Lauren's murder. To them, it was clear that he'd been obsessed with her, and since he had a key to her apartment, plus Lauren's repeated complaints about things being moved around while she was gone, the picture started to come together. Stephen had been sneaking into her home all along. Still, there was one major problem. They didn't yet have any solid evidence directly linking him to the crime. During questioning, detectives tried everything they could to get a confession, but Stephen's behavior was pretty weird. For hours, he sat motionless, answering in a barely audible voice, repeating only 3 phrases: yes, no, and I don't know.
And you lived next to Lauren for a long time?
Yes.
Have you ever seen her with that dress on?
No.
You have no idea where she's at?
No.
Just tell me what happened, brother.
I don't know.
The detectives grew increasingly frustrated. They pressured him, even tried the classic bluff, claiming they'd found his DNA at the crime scene and that the only thing that could help him now was to confess. But Stephen, who'd studied law himself, didn't fall for it. He stayed completely calm, emotionless, and silent.
You know what's crazy? I was talking to people that he works with and everything. They talk about how he's always expresses himself.
But he don't know.
He's very talkative. Stephen, they say you're so talkative, buddy, that you always so friendly. You stop in and say hello, and you talk. Why is it that you're acting so short with us tonight? If you have all this character and personality about you, why is it that everything that we get from you is yes, no, or I don't know?
I don't know.
Well, you sure were talking to the media tonight, weren't you?
They asked what happened.
Yeah, that's what we're asking you. What happened? What'd you tell them?
I told them
You
what
didn't-
I knew.
That you didn't know. Hmm?
Do you realize how you're talking right now? Does it not feel weird to you?
No.
Would you say that this is how you talk all the time?
I don't understand.
You're just not expressing yourself at all. Everything's with you is yes, no, I don't remember, I don't understand. You can't help me out with anything. There's nothing you can tell me to help me about this beautiful girl right here, Stephen. That was your friend. Nothing. You gonna let things go down like this?
I don't know what you want.
I want the truth, Stephen. We just wanted to give you an opportunity to tell it, so you didn't look like a monster at the end. Because you know what? I don't believe that you're a monster, Stephen. I believe that you're a good guy. You've been picked on. Girls didn't show you the respect that you deserved. You did something stupid. And I believe you feel bad about it. And that's why you're all freaked out right now. But I'm giving you the opportunity to get right. I'm giving you an opportunity to show everybody you're not a monster, that you feel bad about what happened. Your hair's there, man. Your hair is there. We got your hair with the body. How's that, Stephen?
I don't know.
Yes, you do know. Yes, you do know, Stephen. That's right, buddy. See that? Look at it. See how easy? It happens. And it happened to you. Why, Stephen?
I don't understand.
Oh, you understand. You understand exactly what I'm saying. See this stuff right here, your hair? Yeah, it fell out of your head when you was moving the body, Stephen. That's right. You remember moving the body?
No.
Yes, you do, Stephen.
Eventually, the detectives left him alone in the interrogation room, and Stephen just sat there for a long time, perfectly still, staring blankly at the wall.
Just stay right here, okay?
Okay.
I appreciate all your cooperation tonight, okay?
Okay.
Officers also asked him to remove his shirt so they could check for any recent injuries. That's when they noticed several scratches across his torso, marks that looked like they'd been made by fingernails. When asked about them, Stephen simply said he had no idea where they came from. Maybe, he suggested, he'd scratched himself in his sleep. Police eventually realized there was no way they'd get a confession out of Stephen, so they shifted their focus to finding hard evidence. They began combing through every inch of the apartment complex, and soon they caught a break. In a maintenance room, officers discovered a hacksaw that perfectly matched the packaging found in Stephen's apartment. It had clearly been scrubbed clean, but forensic experts still managed to find tiny fragments of human tissue on the blade, and DNA tests confirmed they belonged to Lauren. From there, detectives traced the purchase of that same saw back to a local hardware store and pulled the surveillance footage from that day. On the video, clear as day, was Stephen McDaniel buying the saw himself. Investigators also interviewed the maintenance worker who had access to that room, but the man provided a solid alibi for the night of the murder. That left only one person who could have opened the door: Stephen, the man with a master key. Detectives then started digging deeper into his background and talking to people who knew him. Everyone described Stephen as quiet, withdrawn, and just strange, but also very intelligent. Several classmates mentioned that when he met new people, he would ask them two unsettling questions. What would you do in a zombie apocalypse? And how would you commit the perfect murder? Because of his odd behavior, he didn't really have any friends, and most classmates avoided him outside of school. The only person who ever tried to be kind to him was actually Lauren. She found him a bit unusual, but still treated him with respect and kindness. Over the 3 years they lived next door, Stephen had asked her out several times, but Lauren had always politely turned him down. Outside of school, he barely had a life. He spent nearly all of his time at home, with his curtains constantly drawn and no one ever coming or going. In the weeks following Stephen's arrest, police kept searching for more evidence, but every lead came up empty. They also continued combing through nearby areas, hoping to find the rest of Lauren's remains. But that search ended in failure too. The only thing detectives managed to uncover was a lab report confirming that the pair of women's underwear found in Stephen's apartment belonged to Lauren. But soon after, investigators discovered something that sent chills even down the spines of seasoned detectives. On one of the memory cards seized from Stephen's apartment, they found a video, recorded just hours before Lauren's death. Using a long wooden stick, Stephen had taped a small camera to the end of it and lifted it up to Lauren's window, secretly filming the inside of her apartment. That footage erased any lingering doubt about his guilt, and a few weeks later, formal charges were filed, not only for Lauren's murder, but also for 30 counts of possession of illegal material involving minors. As the case moved toward trial, Stephen pleaded not guilty, while prosecutors announced their intention to seek the death penalty. His defense attorney, a former professor who had actually taught both Lauren and Stephen, claimed that police might have framed his client, planting evidence in the apartment to make him look guilty. He also argued against the death penalty, pointing out that Lauren herself had been publicly opposed to it. But in the end, the judge sided with the prosecution. The road to trial dragged on for years. The prosecution knew that with the evidence they had, Stephen still stood a real chance of walking free, because to pursue the death penalty, they needed absolute, irrefutable proof. And the truth was, most of what they had was circumstantial, so a skilled defense attorney could easily plant doubt in the minds of the jury. After some consideration, the prosecution made a calculated decision. They offered Stephen a plea deal. If he confessed in full detail and pled guilty to the murder, the state would drop all the charges related to illegal materials, and more importantly, take the death penalty off the table. In 2014, 3 years after Lauren's death, Stephen finally agreed. According to his confession, around 4:30 in the morning, he dressed entirely in black, from head to toe, mask and gloves included. Using the spare key, he quietly unlocked Lauren's door and slipped inside, managing to bypass the door brace she used for extra security. Stephen crept into her bedroom and stood there for a while, just watching as she slept. Then, at some point, the floor creaked beneath him. Lauren woke up, startled, and when she saw a masked figure in her room, she told him to get out. That's when he jumped at her and started choking her while she fought back. At some point, Lauren managed to tear off his mask, and when she did, she saw it was Stephen. Lauren begged him to stop, but he didn't. The struggle went on for nearly 15 minutes before he finally realized she wasn't breathing anymore. Stephen then carried her body into the bathroom and left it there overnight. The next evening, he returned with tools, including a hacksaw, and spent several hours dismembering the body. He placed the remains into trash bags and scattered them across multiple dumpsters near the university. As for the torso, he dumped it in the bin beside their apartment complex, assuming the garbage truck would pick it up soon. Afterward, he cut up his mask, gloves, and shirt into small pieces and flushed them down the toilet. Stephen claimed he didn't really know why he killed Lauren. According to him, he'd suffered some kind of mental blackout and genuinely believed she was still alive afterward, which, he said, was why he took part in the search for her. But prosecutors didn't buy that story for a second. In their view, Stephen had been obsessed with Lauren for a long time. His social media history, the video he filmed through her window, and his disturbing online activity all pointed to someone consumed by dark fantasies about violence and control. The forums he frequented and the content he viewed made it clear he was fascinated by inflicting pain on women. And with Lauren just days away from moving out of the apartment complex, prosecutors believed he acted out of desperation. He couldn't stand the thought of losing sight of her forever. Either way, his confession sealed his fate. Stephen McDaniel was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole in 2041. 4 years later, he filed an appeal, and this time, he decided to represent himself. He argued that police had violated his rights from the very beginning, yelling at him during interrogation, refusing to let him use the bathroom without permission, and even denying him medical help during what he claimed was a seizure, unless he allowed them to search his apartment. He also accused his former attorney of failing to defend him properly. The lawyer, in turn, responded that Stephen had been given a remarkably good deal, life with a chance of parole instead of a death sentence, and that no attorney could have done better under the circumstances. Despite his efforts, the appeal was denied. In 2022, Stephen filed yet another one, but that too was rejected. It's worth mentioning that some of his relatives still insist he was framed. His father even created a fundraising page to hire a new lawyer for him, but no one donated a single dollar, and the page was quickly taken down. So, Stephen remains behind bars to this day, still trying to overturn his conviction. But according to most legal experts, the odds are stacked against him, and it's almost certain he'll spend the rest of his life in prison. Michelle Beats was born on February 22, 1953, in New Zealand. She had an older brother, 2 younger sisters, and loving parents. Michelle grew up as a cheerful, outgoing kid. She loved horseback riding, swimming, and spending time with her friends. At 13, she was accepted into a prestigious girls' school where she worked hard and excelled in her studies. Michelle had always dreamed of helping people and becoming a doctor, so she took her education seriously from an early age. After finishing school, she earned her medical degree and began working at a hospital in Auckland. But eventually, she decided to move to Australia. She settled in Sydney and started working at a large hospital, continuing her career as a nurse. Around the same time, Michelle met a man named David, and the two began dating. Over the years, she worked her way up to become the head of nursing at the hospital, a role she earned through her dedication and passion for the job. At one point, she was even selected to join the medical team assigned to accompany the Pope during his visit to Australia. On April 27, 2010, 57-year-old Michelle started her day like any other, heading out early for her hospital shift and returning home around 6 in the evening. On her way, she also stopped by a local shopping center to pick up some groceries. At about 6:20 p.m., a couple walking their dog down Michelle's street heard a woman screaming. Alarmed, they followed the sound, which led them straight to Michelle's house. They saw a man in a hoodie, wearing a balaclava and carrying a backpack, climbing out from her yard. When they tried to stop him, he took off running and disappeared. As the couple approached the house, they saw a woman lying on the floor of the front veranda. When they got closer and checked for a pulse, they noticed a deep wound across her neck. She was still conscious and turned her head toward them, as if trying to say something, but the injury was too severe for her to make a sound. Before help could arrive, Michelle passed away, and police were called to the scene. The first thing investigators did was confirm the victim's identity. It was indeed Michelle. In addition to the deep cut on her neck, the coroner found multiple stab wounds and clear signs that she had fought desperately to defend herself. At first, detectives suspected it might have been a robbery gone wrong. Judging by the scene, it looked like Michelle was attacked the moment she stepped onto the veranda with her grocery bags. They theorized she might have surprised a burglar, who then killed her in a panic. That idea seemed to make sense. After all, the back door showed clear signs of forced entry. But as soon as investigators looked closer, that theory began to fall apart. There were no traces of the intruder inside, and nothing in the house was missing. Then, they found something even more telling. Someone had cut the power lines outside. completely shutting off electricity to the house, including the alarm system. The security company was immediately alerted and tried calling both Michelle's home phone and her cell, but she didn't pick up. They then reached out to David, who said he was only a few minutes away from the house and would go check it out. When David arrived, the street was already filled with police cars and an ambulance. And when he learned that Michelle had been murdered, he fainted on the spot. Given how brutal the attack was, detectives quickly concluded it was most likely personal. David, naturally, was the first person of interest, especially since he'd said he was nearby at the time. But soon they confirmed his alibi. He'd been in another place during the attack, and there wasn't a single trace of blood on him. So, police cleared him and kept searching for new leads. Unfortunately, there wasn't much to go on. The crime scene offered almost nothing, just a few faint, smudged footprints leading from the house toward a nearby street. Since that matched the direction in which witnesses said the suspect had fled, officers began pulling footage from hundreds of surveillance cameras along the route and beyond. Meanwhile, news of Michelle's murder spread quickly across the city, and it sent shockwaves through her neighborhood. It was an upscale, peaceful area where crime was virtually unheard of, and even petty thefts were rare. Since the killer had left behind almost no trace, detectives started to wonder if this wasn't his first crime, or if he might have had experience in law enforcement or even military. They also suspected he'd been watching Michelle for a while, learning her daily routine. He'd cut the wires leading into the house, which also disabled the motion-activated lights on the veranda. That seemed deliberate. By the time Michelle got home, it was already getting dark, and without that light, the killer could easily hide near the door and wait for her to arrive. While officers combed through surveillance footage looking for the suspect, detectives began interviewing Michelle's friends and colleagues. Staff at the hospital where she worked said there had been issues in the past with certain patients who'd harassed nurses, but investigators found no link between those incidents and Michelle's murder. They also learned that Michelle had once fired an employee for stealing prescription drugs from the hospital storage room, but that lead too went nowhere. However, as detectives kept talking to her coworkers, one name kept coming up again and again: a man named Walter, whose behavior, everyone said, had always been strange. Walter was originally from the United States. He'd come to Australia on a work visa and got a job as a nurse at the same hospital where Michelle worked. She was actually his supervisor, the one who signed off on his employment papers. But just a few months before the murder, Michelle decided not to renew his contract after multiple complaints had been filed against him. Several nurses had reported his inappropriate behavior, and overall, staff were afraid of him. He had a reputation for being short-tempered and unpredictable. In fact, Michelle even asked a colleague to stay in the room with her when she broke the news to Walter that he was being let go, because she was genuinely worried about how he might react. But that wasn't the end of it. After he was fired, Michelle told coworkers she'd seen Walter near her house several times, which understandably terrified her. Detectives quickly realized that Walter might have been stalking her in the days leading up to the murder. They also learned that he had previously served in the U.S. Marine Corps and had extensive combat training. Still, when investigators questioned him, Walter denied having anything to do with Michelle's death. He claimed there had never been any bad blood between them. He said he didn't hold a grudge about losing his job and barely even knew her, since, according to him, they hardly ever interacted at work. Other hospital employees, however, told a very different story. They said Walter and Michelle saw each other almost every day, and that there was definite tension between them. Walter also insisted that he had no reason to hate her, since the only reason he'd wanted to keep the job in the first place was for his visa. But even after being fired, he managed to keep it and continued living in Australia legally. As for the night of the murder, Walter said he'd met his wife at the train station around 7 p.m., and that they'd went home together. He swore he'd never been anywhere near Michelle's house that evening. Police searched his house, but came up empty. Even so, Walter was still their prime suspect. They just didn't have the evidence to nail him yet. And then, just days after Michelle's murder, something eerie happened. Walter ended up in the very same hospital he'd been fired from. He'd suffered some kind of seizure, and the staff, Michelle's own colleagues, had to treat the man everyone already suspected might have killed her. Meanwhile, detectives kept going through hundreds of hours of surveillance footage, and eventually, they caught a break. On one of the recordings from a shopping center less than a mile from Michelle's house, they spotted a man who looked a lot like Walter. The timestamp showed he was there just 10 minutes after the murder. But that wasn't all. The footage also showed him tossing his backpack into a trash bin before walking away. When investigators brought Walter back in and showed him the footage, he didn't seem nervous at all. He admitted it was him on the video, but said he'd just stopped by the mall to run some errands, and that the backpack was old, something he'd been meaning to throw away for a while. Police sent crews out to multiple landfill sites across the city, trying to track down that bag, but came up empty-handed. Despite all the suspicious details, detectives still didn't have enough to charge him with anything. For the next few weeks, investigators struggled to find any new leads. It was starting to look like the killer had completely covered his tracks, and that justice might never come. But then, 3 weeks after the murder, everything changed in the most unexpected way. Walter's wife, Samantha, came forward and told police she was ready to testify against her husband, in exchange for full immunity. According to his wife, Walter hated Michelle for not renewing his contract. He also believed she'd given bad references about him to other hospitals, which made it impossible for him to find another job. He complained about Michelle to his wife, insulted her, and eventually started talking about getting revenge. At first, he told his wife he just wanted to scare Michelle in a very odd way. He said he'd dress up as a Mormon and go to her house to silently hand her a religious pamphlet. Pretty quickly, he shifted into darker territory, claiming he worked for some secret Irish organization that had finally given him permission to kill, and that he'd be paid a lot of money to do it. In the weeks before Michelle's death, he began preparing. He watched her, learning her routines and routes, and called her home phone from payphones more than 30 times to figure out when she was home. He even drove past her house to watch her, often not even trying to hide, and Michelle said she'd spotted him several times. His wife also told police that Walter practiced knife strikes on her and her brother, focusing on how to cut a throat silently, a technique she said he'd learned in the military. He'd take the knife every morning when he woke up, and again before bed, just sitting and staring at it. A few days before the murder, he bought a whole outfit from a thrift store, including gloves, and paid in cash so the purchase couldn't be traced. On the day of the murder, Walter did meet his wife, but not at the train station. They met at the same shopping center where he later threw away his backpack. When she tried to kiss him, he told her not to touch him because he was dirty, then admitted he had just killed Michelle. Walter said he broke a window at Michelle's house and tried to pry open the back door to make it look like a break-in. He also cut the wires leading to the house to disable the porch lights and waited for her to come home. But despite all that planning, something went wrong. Walter had intended to ambush Michelle from behind, but that evening her car broke down, so she had to park on a different spot. When she finally stepped onto the porch, she saw him and screamed. Walter told her he wouldn't hurt her if she stayed quiet. Michelle said, "Okay, I won't scream. I'm just afraid you'll hurt me." Right after that, Walter slashed her throat and stabbed her several times in the upper body. When he saw a couple running toward the house after hearing the scream, he fled. He changed clothes behind a nearby garage, stuffed his bloody outfit and knife into his backpack, and threw it away at the mall. Samantha explained that she hadn't gone to the police sooner because she was terrified, afraid that if she talked, Walter would kill her too. Around that same time, detectives got a call from a journalist who said she had some interesting information to share. She told them she'd met Walter in the early days of the investigation, right after reporters learned that police were starting to suspect him. She got his phone number, and over the next 2 weeks, they spoke several times. During all those conversations, Walter kept insisting he was innocent, until one day, he called her again and said he needed to tell her something unpleasant. He admitted that he had killed Michelle, saying it was a contract killing for a large amount of money. Walter claimed he'd been diagnosed with cancer and wanted to make sure his wife had enough money to return to her home country, Vietnam, and start a business there. The journalist immediately contacted detectives, who, as it turned out, were already interviewing Walter's wife at that very moment. Her brother also confirmed that Walter had practiced knife attacks on him, and even asked him to come along to Michelle's house to act as a lookout during the murder. That was all the police needed to make an arrest. Walter was charged with murder, but refused to plead guilty, and he was sent to jail to await trial. A few months later, guards found him in his cell bleeding heavily and rushed him to the hospital, where doctors managed to save his life. It turned out Walter had done it to himself, so he was placed under close supervision. The trial began about a year and a half after the murder, and Walter still refused to plead guilty. He showed little interest in what was happening and barely participated in the process, leaving everything to his lawyer. His attorney argued that there were no physical pieces of evidence linking Walter to the crime and tried to challenge the statements made by his wife and brother. According to the defense, they had every reason to lie. After all, they had both struck a deal with prosecutors and were granted full immunity. And that wasn't all. As part of the agreement, they were also promised Australian visas. To the defense, that was more than enough motivation to tell the police exactly what they wanted to hear. The lawyer also claimed that Walter had suffered a serious brain injury in a car accident 2 years before the murder and might not have been fully aware of his actions. However, before the trial, Walter underwent a medical evaluation, and experts found no signs of any mental condition that could excuse him from responsibility. The prosecution's main evidence came down to the testimony of Walter's wife and her brother, along with the security footage. Even though there was no physical evidence linking him to the scene, the prosecutor argued that the large amount of circumstantial evidence was more than enough to prove his guilt. According to the prosecution, Walter's motive was simple. He was furious at Michelle for refusing to renew his contract and decided to take revenge. In the end, the jury found him guilty, and in March 2012, Walter was sentenced to life in prison. He showed no emotion whatsoever and barely seemed to register what was happening around him. When the judge asked him to stand for the verdict, he didn't even seem to hear it. His lawyer had to repeat the request. Throughout the trial, though, Walter often smiled and made strange gestures toward Michelle's relatives sitting in the courtroom. After the trial, another disturbing detail came to light. In the United States, Walter had an ex-wife and a child, and he owed them more than $50,000 in unpaid child support. That was one of the reasons he'd clung so tightly to his Australian visa. He didn't want to go back and face those debts. Later, investigators discovered that just a few weeks before Michelle's death, Walter had actually flown to the US, planning to kill his ex-wife. For reasons that remain unknown, he never went through with it and returned to Australia, where he shifted his focus entirely to Michelle. As for his claims about working for a secret Irish organization, detectives found no trace of evidence to support any of it. The same went for his story about having cancer. There wasn't a single medical record confirming that diagnosis. In 2015, Walter tried to appeal the verdict, arguing that the prosecution shouldn't have mentioned his military background during the trial, but his appeal was denied. Walter remained in prison to serve his life sentence, but 5 years later, guards found him dead in his cell, and the autopsy confirmed that he'd done it himself. And with that, the case finally came to an end, but some things about it still feel unsettling. For instance, it's strange how vividly Walter's wife described every detail of the murder, almost as if she'd been there herself. Maybe Walter told her everything in such detail on purpose, so she could cut a deal with police later and secure her visa. Perhaps he knew he'd end up behind bars anyway and decided to make sure his family got something out of it. That could explain why Samantha only came forward 3 weeks after the murder, immediately demanding immunity and visa. In the end, though, Michelle's legacy lived on. In 2012, the government of New South Wales established an annual award in her honor, given to medical staff who've made outstanding contributions to children's healthcare. Shannon Schieber was born on August 8, 1974, in Maryland. From the very beginning, she stood out as exceptionally bright. By a year and a half, she could recite the entire alphabet, forward and backward. And by 3, she was reading on her own. Shannon graduated high school with honors and went on to Duke University in North Carolina, where she earned a bachelor's degree in just 3 years, triple majoring in math, philosophy, and economics. After graduation, she spent a year at a finance firm, but her plan was always to keep studying. Shannon wanted to go into finance not to get rich, but to help people who were struggling to make ends meet, because fairness and equality really meant something to her. At 23, she got a full scholarship to the prestigious Wharton School, packed up for Pennsylvania, and moved into an apartment in the heart of Philadelphia so she could be close to campus while pursuing her doctorate. And she wasn't just about academics. Shannon was always active. She loved to swim, played lacrosse, and went horseback riding whenever she got the chance. On May 7, 1998, around 2 in the morning, Philadelphia police got a call from a man who lived in the same building as Shannon. He said he'd heard a woman screaming from her apartment, a sharp, terrified cry, followed by a desperate, "Help me." The neighbor stepped into the hallway and walked up to her door. By then, he could hear strange noises coming from inside, like someone gasping for air. He tried the handle, but the door was locked. When no one answered his knocks or calls, he grabbed the phone and dialed 911. While officers were on their way, the neighbor ran downstairs and knocked on a couple's apartment. He was thinking about breaking down Shannon's door, but knew he couldn't do it alone. Unfortunately, only the wife was home. Her husband was at work, so there was no one to help. A few minutes later, the police arrived, less than 5 minutes after the call. When they reached Shannon's door, everything had gone silent. They knocked several times, but there was no response. Thinking the place was empty, they hesitated to act. The neighbor insisted that the screams definitely came from Shannon's apartment, and another woman who lived just below said she'd heard banging sounds at the same time. But the officers figured the noise might have come from the street, and that the neighbor had just misjudged where it came from. The front door showed no signs of forced entry. It was still locked tight. One of the officers even went outside and shined his flashlight up towards Shannon's balcony. The curtains were drawn, and the door was shut. Putting all that together, they decided there wasn't enough reason to break in. Before leaving, they told the neighbors to call again if they heard anything else, and then drove off. The next morning, Shannon was supposed to meet up with some classmates to study for exams. Later that day, she had plans to grab coffee with her brother, but she never showed up to either. Worried, her brother drove over to her apartment. Right away, he noticed the balcony door was open, though the curtains were still drawn. He knocked on the door several times, but no one answered. With no cell phone, he drove over to a friend's place and called his mom. She told him to head back and ask Shannon's neighbors if anyone had a spare key, or to try getting in touch with the building manager. So he went back and started knocking on every door in the hallway, but most people weren't home. The first person to answer was the same neighbor who had called the police the night before. When Shannon's brother explained who he was and why he was there, the man's face immediately changed. He realized something was seriously wrong. He told him about the screams and the call he made to 911 just hours earlier. Together, they rushed to Shannon's apartment and forced the door open. What they saw inside was horrifying. Shannon was lying face down on her bed, completely naked, and it was immediately clear that she was dead. Police handed Shannon's body over to the medical examiners and began combing through the apartment. There were no signs of forced entry on the front door, so detectives figured the killer might have gotten in through the balcony. Her place was on the second floor, but there was a tree right next to the balcony that someone could have easily climbed. It even had a metal guard on it, but with enough skill, it wouldn't have been hard to get past. Inside the apartment, there were clear signs of a struggle. Books were scattered all over the floor near the bed, and there were bloodstains on the blanket, the walls, and even out on the balcony. It looked like Shannon had fought back hard and possibly injured her attacker, since the blood trail leading outside seemed to belong to him. On the bed, investigators also found traces of semen, which they sent to the lab along with the blood sample for DNA testing. Detectives later realized that a few of Shannon's things were missing. The killer had taken a pin, a necklace, her backpack, a camera, and a stack of CDs. The medical examiners determined that Shannon had died from strangulation and also found signs of sexual assault. They discovered someone else's blood on her teeth. Apparently, she'd bitten her attacker hard enough to make him bleed. As for the time of death, the experts estimated it happened just minutes before her neighbor called the police. though it was impossible to pinpoint the exact moment. Still, one thing immediately stood out. When the police came that night, the balcony door was shut. But when Shannon's brother and the neighbor broke in the next morning, it was open. And since the neighbor had heard choking sounds before he even called 911, it meant Shannon was likely already dead by the time officers arrived at her door. In other words, the killer was probably still inside the apartment when police stood just a few feet away, and then slipped out afterward. The blood and semen found in Shannon's apartment were both tested, but the DNA belonged to an unknown man who wasn't in any database. Detectives also circulated a list of Shannon's stolen belongings, her pen, jewelry, backpack, camera, and CDs, to local pawn shops, hoping the killer might try to sell them, but nothing came up. They even looked into one of Shannon's classmates as a possible suspect, but his DNA didn't match the killer's. Another lead came from Shannon's friends and family. Just 2 days before she died, she told them about a strange man who had followed her on the street. She walked around the block a few extra times to make sure he didn't learn where she lived. Police didn't rule out that this could have been her killer, but the tip didn't bring them any closer to finding him. From that point on, the investigators hit a dead end. For months, there were no major developments, and detectives were no closer to finding the person responsible. That changed nearly a year later, when the case suddenly took a strange new turn. A man called the Philadelphia Inquirer, a local newspaper, claiming to have information about Shannon's murder. He wouldn't give his name, but said the police had completely missed something crucial. The case, he insisted, was connected to several other attacks on women that had happened in the same area. The journalists decided to look into it, and sure enough, they found that a series of eerily similar crimes had been taking place right in the heart of Philadelphia. On June 20th, 1997, a year before Shannon's murder, a man broke into a woman's apartment through a window and attacked her. He tried to force himself on her, but she managed to talk him out of it. As soon as he left, she called the police and even handed over a strand of his hair that had fallen on her bed. But for some reason, the police never sent it to the lab for testing. 3 weeks later, on July 11th, another woman came home from a party after drinking quite a bit. She fell asleep right away, but a few hours later she woke up to find that all her clothes were gone and her hair was soaking wet. She also had scratches on her neck and burst a blood vessel in her eyes. She reported it to police, but they labeled it as a burglary. Then, on August 6th, yet another woman was attacked in her apartment. A man climbed in through a window, covered her head with a pillow, wrapped a belt around her neck, and sexually assaulted her before fleeing. Investigators recovered DNA from the bedsheet, but since there wasn't yet a national FBI DNA database, they didn't compare it to other cases. A week later, on August 13th, a woman woke up to find a stranger standing in her bedroom. He sexually assaulted her and took off. This time, police collected DNA again, and when they finally compared it to the previous case from August 6th, it turned out to be an exact match. All of these women lived close to one another, some even on the same street. But for reasons that still baffle people to this day, police didn't classify most of these incidents as sexual assaults, so there was never a full investigation. As reporters dug deeper, they found that this wasn't just a fluke. It was common practice within the Philadelphia Police Department at the time. A huge number of rape reports weren't officially recorded as crimes. Many officers simply didn't believe the victims. In fact, some senior officials openly claimed that half the women who report rape are lying. Eventually, the newspaper ran a story that blew the whole thing wide open, and it sparked a massive public outcry. The backlash forced police to review every sexual assault report that had never been classified as a crime, and in the process, they ended up reclassifying around 1,500 cases. The article also devoted significant attention to Shannon's murder, pointing out what now seemed like an obvious connection between her case and the earlier assaults, and calling out the police for failing to link them sooner. When Shannon first moved to Philadelphia for college, she'd chosen that apartment specifically because the neighborhood was considered safe, but neither she nor her neighbors had any idea that a serial predator was operating right under their noses, largely because police hadn't recognized the pattern in his attacks. After the article's release, investigators were forced to change their approach completely. Up until then, they'd focused mostly on the idea that Shannon's killer might have been someone she knew, perhaps an ex-boyfriend. But now they compared the DNA from her murder to the samples taken from the sexual assault cases, and the results were unmistakable. They belonged to the same man. Still, the detectives had no clue who he was. They didn't even have a name. But there was one promising lead. One of the assault victims had seen her attacker's face and given police a description months earlier. Investigators used that to create a composite sketch, which they distributed to local newspapers, along with an announcement of a $40,000 reward for any information leading to the suspect's capture. The calls started pouring in, but every single lead hit a dead end. That went on until September 13th, when the attacker struck again, this time targeting another woman in the same area. He assaulted her, but once again managed to slip away before police could catch him. Not long after, one of the detectives working Shannon's case happened to catch a TV episode about investigators who'd solved a crime using something called geographic profiling. The idea was simple but interesting. Experts analyzed the location of crimes committed by the same offender and used that pattern to pinpoint where he's most likely living. The team reached out to the same specialist featured in that show, and he put together a map highlighting the areas where their suspect might be based. Detectives hit those neighborhoods, plastering flyers with a composite sketch and talking to residents, but none of it led anywhere. After that, the attacks suddenly stopped. For months, there wasn't a single new report, and detectives started to think the man who terrorized the city had finally gone underground. That pattern continued until the middle of 2000, when detectives noticed a request that had come in from their colleagues at the Colorado Police Department. Investigators there had sent out a nationwide bulletin about a string of sexual assaults that had taken place in the city of Fort Collins, nearly 2,000 miles from Philadelphia. The moment the Philadelphia team saw the report, something clicked. The attacker's methods were nearly identical to those of their elusive killer. He broke into apartments where women were home alone, assaulted them, and then vanished. What's more, he left behind several DNA samples and a fingerprint. Investigators in Philadelphia asked for those samples to be compared with the ones recovered from Shannon's apartment, and the results came back as a perfect match. Their killer had moved clear across the country and kept attacking women. For the first time, police finally had a real shot at uncovering his identity. They decided to dig into credit card transaction data from both sets of crimes, the ones in Philadelphia and Fort Collins, hoping to find people whose cards had been used in both cities around the time of the assaults. It wasn't an easy task, but after combing through thousands of records, they narrowed it down to a list of 319 men between the ages of 20 and 30, whose cards had been active in both places during the attacks. Then, using the geographic profiling map, they focused on certain Philadelphia neighborhoods where the suspect was likely to have lived, shrinking that list even further, down to just 83 names. They sent that narrowed list over to their colleagues in Colorado, who started checking whether any of those names might be connected to the assaults. But before they can make progress, the attacker struck again. Not long after, a letter arrived at the same police station. It read, "I'm sorry, but I can't let you catch me just yet. I'm not in Colorado anymore. I didn't even like it there. I'm not a fan of the cold, and I don't plan on coming back to Fort Collins. I have to admit, you guys are everywhere. I want you to catch me, because I hate what I'm doing. It keeps me away from people, and I don't have anyone to talk to. Sometimes, I get really lonely." The letter also included details about several assaults that only investigators would know about, confirming it had been written by the attacker himself. Still, there were no fingerprints or DNA anywhere on it. Detectives believed the letter was meant to throw them off, that maybe he was lying about leaving Fort Collins. But even with that theory, they were no closer to catching him, and time was running out. The biggest issue was the statute of limitations for sexual assault in Pennsylvania, just 5 years. The first known attacks dated back to 1997, which meant police had less than 2 years left to bring justice to Philadelphia victims, even though the murder of Shannon Schieber would carry a life sentence, or worse, no matter when he was caught. Detectives kept reaching out to the public for help, and over the course of the investigation, they got thousands of calls. And finally, in 2002, one tip finally stood out. A woman called them and said the composite sketch of the suspect looked a lot like her ex-boyfriend, a man named Troy Graves. That immediately caught detectives' attention because his name was already on their list of 83 possible suspects. But that wasn't all. Not long after, another call came in, this time from a man who'd said he'd seen the description of the suspect's car, one that had been spotted by a victim. He told police his neighbor drove the exact same type of vehicle, and that his neighbor's name was again Troy Graves. When detectives started digging into his background, the pieces began to line up. Troy had worked at a bank located right in the same Philadelphia neighborhood where all the attacks took place. In 1999, right around the time the crimes suddenly stopped, he enlisted in the army. Not long after, he got written up for trying to force his way into a woman's room, though he denied it ever happened. Troy was stationed in Wyoming, but actually lived just across the state line, in Fort Collins, Colorado. So, he had lived in both cities where the attacks had occurred. When investigators tracked down his ex-girlfriend, she told them something else unsettling. Troy often went out for night walks and would come home with scratches and bruises he couldn't explain. To top it off, Troy's blood type matched the one found at Shannon's crime scene. Everything pointed to him as their guy, so detectives decided it was time to talk to him. They went to his house, but he wasn't at home, and one of them slipped a business card into the door. Later, Troy's wife, the woman he'd been married to for about a year, found the card and called the detective back. She said her husband was currently on a military base, but she'd speak to him about the message. Troy agreed to meet with police, but detectives didn't want to take any chances. They sent undercover officers to quietly keep tabs on him, just in case he tried to run. Eventually, Troy showed up at the station, and detectives started with usual routine questions. They noted he had no criminal record, asked him about the incident in the army that got him written up, and then moved on to the assaults in both cities and the murder of Shannon Schieber. Troy denied everything, but when the detectives asked him to provide his fingerprints and a DNA sample, he went completely silent for about 6 seconds. Then, he said he'd be willing to do it, but only after talking to his wife first. He promised to come back and give the samples the next day. At that point, the detectives told him he was under arrest. Officers immediately took his fingerprints and DNA, and when the results came back, they were a perfect match to the blood and semen found in Shannon's apartment, as well as all the other evidence from the assaults in both Philadelphia and Colorado. On April 23rd, Troy Graves was charged with 6 counts of sexual assault in Colorado, 27 charges in total. A few days later, Pennsylvania prosecutors added another 50 counts for the attacks there, including the murder of Shannon Schieber. After his arrest, a few surprising details surfaced. One of Troy's ex-girlfriends had recognized him from the composite sketch on the news long before police figured out who he was, but for some reason, she never came forward. And it turned out that Philadelphia police had actually stopped Troy's car back in January of 1999, right in the middle of the manhunt for Shannon's killer. They talked to him briefly, then let him go, completely unaware that the man they were looking for had been sitting right in front of them. Meanwhile, the question of where Troy would be tried first was still up in the air. In Colorado, he was facing a long prison sentence for the assaults, but in Pennsylvania, he could be sentenced to death for Shannon's murder. While that was being decided, Troy told his attorney he was ready to confess to everything, as long as prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty. And in the end, both states accepted the deal. Before finalizing it, prosecutors spoke with Shannon's parents, and they made their stance very clear. They were firmly against the death penalty, no matter what. Even if Troy didn't confess, they said they couldn't support taking another life. Their faith forbade killing in any form, and they weren't willing to betray their beliefs, even after losing their daughter. They also reached out to all of Troy's surviving victims from Philadelphia and Fort Collins, and every single one of them stood behind that decision. Shannon's parents pointed out something else too, something much deeper. They believed that if police had taken earlier reports of sexual assault more seriously, they would have realized a serial predator was operating in their city long before Shannon was killed, and maybe, just maybe, their daughter would still be alive. The public, however, largely disagreed. Many people didn't understand how Shannon's parents wanted to spare her killer's life. But despite the backlash, they never wavered, and eventually the plea deal went through. After that, Troy laid out every detail of what happened the night Shannon was killed. He said he broke into her apartment through the balcony while she was in the bedroom. Startled, Shannon tried to fight him off. She clawed at his face and even bit his finger. That's when Troy started choking her. She eventually lost consciousness, and he thought he'd snapped her neck. Moments later, he heard knocking at the door, but he insisted that whoever was there never identified themselves as police. He also claimed he didn't see any patrol cars outside when he escaped through the balcony. Still, there were some strange inconsistencies in his confession. Troy said he had closed the balcony door behind him as he left, but Shannon's brother clearly remembered that the door was wide open the next morning. Despite those details, his guilt was undeniable. The DNA, the evidence, the confession, it all pointed straight at him. On May 17th, Troy Graves was sentenced to life in prison for 6 counts of sexual assault in Colorado. After that, he was transferred to Pennsylvania, where he received another life sentence for Shannon's murder, plus an additional 60 to 120 years for the sexual assaults in Philadelphia. So Troy will spend the rest of his life behind bars. But for Shannon's parents, the story didn't end there. Her father filed a lawsuit against the Philadelphia Police Department, arguing that Shannon might still be alive if detectives had connected the earlier assaults and launched a proper investigation. The court, however, ruled that the police weren't responsible for her death, and no one was held accountable. Still, the case drew so much public attention that city officials eventually formed a special committee to review hundreds of ignored sexual assault reports that had piled up over the years. Shannon's parents also kept fighting against the death penalty, traveling across the country to speak in more than 20 states. Her mother even expressed a wish to visit Troy in prison and speak with him face to face, though whether that meeting ever happened remains unknown. Today, Troy Graves is still serving his sentence, with virtually no chance of ever walking free again. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.